Welcome back. So great to be here, and thank you to the organizers for the invitation. My name is Julia Shaletsky. I'm an adjunct professor at the University of California, Berkeley in molecular therapeutics. I run the Molecular Therapeutics Initiative. I'm a biochemist by training, originally from Germany. And I'm really excited to be here. I'm also the co-chair of Heterodox Academy chapter in Berkeley, and have co-authored a paper with Anna and Jay and some other people on analyzing funding streams and intrusion of DEI into taxpayer-funded science funding. And I have an active research project in this area at the moment and been in this field for a little bit. And it's my great pleasure to introduce Jerry Coyne and Luana Maroja to you as well. They're both professors. Luana is an evolutionary biologist and professor at Williams College, got her undergrad and master's degree from the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, and a PhD from Cornell University. She's interested in population ecology, phylogeny, speciation, population genetics, phylogeography, and has done extensive fieldwork in Brazil, Panama, and in the US. She works on a variety of organisms, including small mammals, crickets, butterflies, loves animals, as I can tell, you know, and has published more than 35 scientific papers. And then Jerry doesn't need an introduction, but I'll give you one. Jerry Coyne is Professor Emeritus in the Department of Ecology and Evolution at the University of Chicago, where he worked on the genetics of species formation, specializing in fruit flies. He graduated from the College of William and Mary and got his PhD at Harvard University. Besides 125 scientific papers, Jerry co-wrote a scholarly book about his research area of speciation and 2 trade books, Why Evolution is True and Faith versus Fact, Why Science and Religion are Incompatible. He is the recipient of a Guggenheim Award and the Richard Dawkins Award, was president of the Society for the Study of Evolution, and is a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. So welcome, both of you. And today our panel is about censorship and pseudoscience in the life sciences, and I would even say more broadly about integrity of science. This is something many scientists take for granted because we all grew up with integrity of science and, you know, general enlightenment values and liberties that we all take for granted because we can't really remember a time when they weren't there. But things are slowly eroding, and I think it's very important that we nip in the bud the denial of reality that is penetrating several fields and has been penetrating several fields, including ours, of natural science. And as natural scientists, we're uniquely rooted in observing things as they are and testing and experimenting with these systems, and has become difficult in some areas due to ideological and politicization of science that has been taking place. I just want to take a minute to think about why this is important, because sometimes I talk to my colleagues and they don't really see why it's important to fight for this and to nip this in the bud. And it's really the negative effects that are there both for scientists and for society at large. I mean, on societal levels, if we do science that is compelled or guided into politically desirable directions or censored, we don't produce the data that's needed to make good decisions. We use tax money to generate projects that keep people busy but don't generate data that is reliable for politicians to make best decisions based on. And so in the end, we have outcomes that cause morbidity, mortality, and also economic loss. And it's directly related to the fact that we can't answer the question according to the best science, but we have to, you know, certain questions can't be asked. And then there's also negative effect on scientists themselves. We can't pursue truth if science is compromised that way. And also the next generation coming after us is increasingly brainwashed, which has been an issue, and really puts into question the long-term viability of this scientific endeavor, which is not something that naturally arises over time in all societies. It's really a product of the Enlightenment, and something we should be proud of. Science is hard to do. You can't really trust yourself. You have to constantly question yourself. You have to accept others' input as being maybe better, maybe you're wrong about something. These are all things that don't come natural to human beings, and we had to fight for those, and also for the ability to do science without influence of religion or very powerful people in the past. And so that's how I want to frame this. This is why it's important to fight for this. And I would like to start by asking both of you how you got into this field. Like, what was your moment when you said you had to take action? Yeah.
Okay. I got involved in this, I think it was 2018, due to events that I started noticing right after the first election of Trump. So it started in the classroom. So I teach at a liberal arts school. And in the classroom one day, I taught genetics for years before that. And I teach a part on heritability, where I also discuss IQ and the influence of genes and the environment and all that. And in that day, a student stood up in the audience, and first she said that IQ is not real and you can't measure it. And then that heritability was also a problem. And finally, the next semester, I got a huge letter pushing back on kin selection, which is just the idea that relatives help each other, and the example was bees and queens and stuff like that. And I got like a 3-page email saying that basically I was endorsing Trump hiring Ivanka. I should have done like Carol Hooven and sent that to my chair, and so I did, and I just responded to the email saying, no, this is not the case, you know, like we you know, what happens naturally does not mean that we should emulate or imitate and so on. Then it was just the next semester when we had these invitations for various speakers, controversial speakers. Derbyshire was one. We tried to pass the Chicago Statement after these invited speakers got so much publicity due to their disinvitations that I thought, why are we doing that? You know, why are we getting them more famous? The students broke into one of the faculty meetings discussing the Chicago Statement, telling all white professors to sit down and confess to their privilege, and they were carrying free speech harms signs. And in the end, as I was not a white male professor, I didn't have to sit down. In the end, I was the only one discussing back with them and saying, you know, you really want to... the craziness continued, right? And it's almost never ending. Then the case of Abigail Thompson, that she mentions a person who got an award this week. This person is in my college. And I saw when he started the cancellation campaign, against her, and we took action to various colleagues in the college took action to fight that. And this person continued to get like more and more prestige inside the college, talking to alums, talking to, and until very recently, this person was very high up in contact with the administration and so on. Then more craziness continued, never ends. Every week there is a new one. So we start to get pushback against teaching the sex binary in biology. My colleagues said that they're not going to touch that with a 10-foot pole. They're not going to teach that. And I started teaching. I use clickers so the students can vote anonymously. And I started asking, like, oh, how many sexes are there? And I would give options from 2 to infinite, it's a continuum. And there's more people voting on the infinite is a continuum than any other category. And only 5% of the students were voting on 2. So these are beginning, by the way, not no majors. This is majors. This is biologists. They don't know that there are 2 kinds of gametes, that sex is defined by gametes, and instead they think it's defined by hairiness. That was my next slide, was like, how is it defined? And hairiness was a top one. It was like, how do you define hairiness in sea urchins or plants? Never mind. So then we had a bunch of surprises. So climate scientists claiming that climate change is an invention of white colonialists to justify the colonization of Africa. This is a professor at environmental studies. There was then like just 2 weeks ago. I had a gender study, Africana study, and DEI invited speaker to talk about fat studies and how fatness is actually quite healthy and there is no excessive mortality, except that doctors are fat phobic and refuse to treat fat patients. So that was why I went to that talk, and the person wrote like the problems of acceptance of fatness, and listed all the isms: racism, sexism, transphobia, all the list. I actually have a funny picture with that Blackboard presentation, and then she wrote science on top. And the amazing thing for me is that in the past we always had, anti-science. People always existed for us. It was like creationism, right? Creationism has always existed. But the college was always opposed to that. They were not being invited by the administration to give talks. They were fringe. They were outside of the academic realm, and we start to see these areas and this resistance to science being endorsed by the university, by the administrators. So this is something that is quite new.
Thank you.
Yes. Oh, okay. Being a hard determinist, I can answer the question of how I got into this in 3 words, which is laws of physics. It's determined from the Big Bang, more or less. But I'll try to confect the story, because our lives are all chaotic, and post facto, we always make up a story that makes sense. So I'll be brief. If, as an evolutionary biologist, one is always assailed by creationists, and I was from the very first day that I taught at the University of Maryland, when in the plaza below my classroom, a preacher was waving his Bible and saying that evolution was a tool of Satan. And that was when I started realizing, well, yeah, there's all these people out there that are believing these lies, the big lies, and as a scientist, of course, you are sworn to fight against things that you know probably untrue. So I spent the first part of my career fighting creationism as well as teaching. And then I guess I have a naturally authoritarian and aggressive personality. That led to a popular book on evolution, why evolution is true. And then I wondered, well, if evolution is true, why didn't my book convince all of Americans to accept evolution? Because only 30% of them, actually 22% of them do. The rest think that God had a hand in it. And then when I investigated, well, why is that true? Then I realized that's religion. So then you get into another realm of big lies that people have to believe. And then that led to another book, which is Faith versus Fact, why evolution and science are incompatible. And as soon as that died down, then all this woke nonsense started, and a lot of it, which we'll talk about today, is anti-biological. The one that riled me the most, which I'm still fighting against this very minute, is the assertion that there is a spectrum of sexes in the human species. Not 2, but maybe 1 million of them. And so wherever you go, it seems there's another battle to fight, and we're fighting battles around biology.
Why don't you tell us a bit about the Freedom from Religion Association, which just was recently a cancellation?
Yeah,
well?
I'll try to be brief about this because we have a lot to cover. The Freedom from Religion Foundation is probably America's most premier organization enforcing the separation of church and state. And I was a huge supporter of that because I'm a free speaker and I'm also an atheist. And I worked with them, and I was proud to get their Emperor Has No Clothes Award made by the Oscar people, which is a picture of a naked emperor for free speaking about religion. And then they put me on their honorary board of directors. And then they published an essay which really hit me on the solar plexus that by one of their interns, that sex is not binary, that there is an infinite number of sexes, and moreover, they cannot be defined biologically. That if you try to define sex by biology, you get into the weeds. You try to use vaginas or penises or hairiness or chromosomes, you don't get a resolution. And that's true, you don't. You do if you get gametes, as Luana said, but you don't get gametes. Anyway, this essay appeared on my favorite organization's website, and I was on their honorary board. And I said, well, I have to do more than just be on this board, I have to do something. So I said, well, I'm going to write a response to that and say, yes, there are only two sexes, and that the person's definition of a woman, which is a woman is whoever thinks she's a woman, which is not only tautological but nonsensical, because you still leaves you with the question of what is a woman. Anyway, I wrote a response to that, and after some back and forth, they put that on their website, the FFRF. Within a day, it was gone. They had taken it down because they considered it a mistake to publish these kinds of views. How dare I say that there are only two sexes? You know, how dare I say that somebody cannot define themselves as a woman? Well, ask any anorexic who thinks that they're fat. Are they really fat? No. They self-define as fat, but that doesn't mean that they're fat. And so humans are prey to all kinds of delusions. Anyway, I was canceled. They took my essay down, I fought back, and they kicked me off the honorary board, or actually they told me that I should resign, and then Richard Dawkins and Steve Pinker, two big fish, went out the door. So I'm still involved in this battle. It's not over yet. I guess they just picked on the wrong person. But I will fight. The hill I will die on is that humans are and all animals and all plants, except for a few algae and fungi, if you consider them plants, have two sexes and two sexes only. Okay. All right, if you want to contest that, we can go outside afterwards.
Yeah. And I recommend the essay. It's really good. It's on Jerry's blog, Why Evolution is True. So if you haven't heard of it, check it out. But yeah, let's dig into this one a bit because it's in a way the craziest and also the strongest push we've seen is to not teach the reality of biological sex, even in microorganisms that reproduce sexually. So the first time I heard about this at my university is that it was difficult in a class talking about yeast biology, which are eukaryotes that reproduce sexually, you know, with a system called A and alpha factors. It's nothing like humans. But the professor who taught that got pushback from students because it enforces the sex binary. So yeast, that was, and at that time everyone was just like, what? You know, you almost couldn't believe it. But it continued over time, and you know, it's definitely a hot button issue. So people are very careful about how to teach it, if to teach it, maybe glance over it. All kinds of things that are related to genetic differences, I would say, between men and women. I mean, maybe you can speak a bit to that, are really difficult to touch, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so it's I think that the main problem of not teaching that in biology is that the whole sexual selection field depends on the sex binary. So if we are to explain why females behave in a different way than males, it all hinges on investing more in offspring than males, and therefore being the rare sex, the valuable sex, the sex that is choosy. Why are females choosy, males are less choosy, and so on. So it leaves an enormous gap in the education of students, and they come from high school without knowing clearly, given my surveys in the classroom. So that's a shocking thing, and it goes beyond that. I have colleagues that got pushback from teaching about sexual conflict, which is the idea that, and this is all, by the way, not using human examples. We are using animal examples, but sexual conflict like, you know, forced copulations, infanticide, and all kinds of things where males are trying to maximize their own reproductive success at the cost, let's say, to the offspring of the lioness or whatnot. And my colleague, one of my colleagues was accused of what was the accusation? Was like basically endorsing sexual harassment.
By studying animals,
yeah.
right? We have to make that clear.
These people don't even know that humans are animals.
Yeah.
So.
Well, we had a good case also biology of frogs, where one of my colleagues was talking about frog biology, and he goes, blah, blah, the female frog, and then a student lifted his arm and said, you can't really say the female frog. You have to say the frog with a uterus. Yeah, and that's a real case. It's not, and it's the
Not
same.
to mention frogs don't have uteruses.
Exactly, so he, biophysicist, was first, I said, what did you say? And he goes, well, honestly, I first had to look up if a frog has a uterus. But it also showcases, you know, I think when I look into what how my colleagues deal with this, most of them haven't thought very hard about the philosophy of science, you know, also all these concepts that come from a different ideology into the natural sciences and how to push back against that, because they all realize this is wrong and totally disturbing. But what do I say to the student? Because now we have to also be careful in how we phrase that, right? And so in the end, often nothing is said. I've spoken to, you know, higher administrators about this, also about facts like the Berkeley News and its official capacity publishing that sex is on a spectrum. And I said, the biology department has to stand up and rebut that. And I was told that, you know, it's just tell me, listen, this is bullshit. Everyone knows this is bullshit. We don't need to do anything. So this is the reaction. I think largely people think this is so out there that every sane person needs to understand that this is just BS. But in the end, they still get to kind of influence reality, and other people, the alumni who read these newsletters and things like that, assume with the good name of the institution, giving credence to this idea that sex is a spectrum. And it's pretty interesting that biologists in general feel these are just a couple of crazy people. We don't have to engage with that. It's almost dangerous to engage because you take it seriously if you engage with it, you know, and it's so out there that I've also heard that argument. But ultimately, we have to push back harder. And I was just reminded today, listening to Carol's great talk, also, you know, in a way, I wish the biology community would have risen up and just said, you know, this is not possible that one of us gets canceled because of teaching the sex binary. I mean, this affects us all, right? And it affects what we can teach. And if we just stand by and let that happen, ultimately they will come for everyone, right?
Yeah, this bears on something a gentleman asked yesterday, I believe. He said, why are we worried about stuff like how many sexes there are and all these trivial questions when the Chinese have hypersonic planes and the oceans are full of plastic and stuff? But in fact, the assertion of bald lies, like there are an infinite number of spectrum, or that a biological woman can be a man just by thinking about it, the public knows that's not true. And what the result of this is that the respect, and we've learned this in the last few days, the respect for not only science itself and for scientists, but for universities in the last 10 years has plummeted. And that is a great harm to society. I mean, without our universities, we lose the ability to generate truth. Without our respect for sciences, it's the same thing happens. So it's not a trivial issue. I mean, yeah, the Chinese may have hypersonic planes, but we have the whole future of education in our hands to do something about it.
I think the other concern is that if we are chasing imaginary things, we can never find solutions, right? So if you have, for example, differences between male and female, it's all imposed. And if we give more cars to girls, they're going to become more engineers and more physics. I don't know. And if that is not true, then we are investing an immense amount of money and energy and even policies in a silly pursuit. Or, for example, I think another thing is trying to understand if you look at the number of females in academia, it's over the roof now, you know, so the problem of access is largely solved. But if you look at the extremes, like who's getting the Nobel Prizes, that's still a huge controversy because more males get the Nobel Prize. But one thing that cannot be said, and I think it was Larry Sumner that suggested that, is that if you have a higher standard deviation in males than in females, then we would potentially expect things like that. But this is taboo even to investigate. You know, and I'm not even saying it's true or not, but it cannot be investigated because somehow this is taboo. So we're left with explanations. The only acceptable explanations for that is going to be that we're sexist and only males are nominated, or that females are not allowed to continue into higher science ends or something like that, yes. Which is maybe we're chasing ghosts, right?
Yes, absolutely. A misuse of funds, and that has been commonplace in the social sciences for a long time. And I have friends, for example, working on poverty and welfare, who say clearly, if you work on poverty and welfare and your research project focuses on individual agency, you will never get funded. So the only way to get it funded is if you focus on outside forces as the key force, making you poor, keeping you where you are. That's clearly not the full truth and reality, but we're just blocking these paths. For us in STEM and the natural sciences, this kind of government influence is honestly a bit new, I think, to us. We're more familiar with industry influence. That has a long history, battles about does salt cause hypertension. You know, food industry is super interested in making sure that that never sees the light of day. That's still going on, although it's clear salt causes hypertension. And, you know, around pesticides, cancer risk and Roundup, you know, things like that. So we kind of used to that influence through lobby organizations and ultimately the government. But now what's new is direct government influence for social engineering that I haven't seen that before. So we all kind of struggling to figure out how to deal with that. But the harms question is very interesting here too, because what you just mentioned, let's just dig into it, maybe with things closer to biology, is like the fat question, you know. I mean, we think harm is done by telling people that they're obese and it's stigmatizing, right, as I understand, or something like that. But then at the same time, the data is really solid on the physiological risks of obesity, right? And somehow I think that's to me is like it's difficult to understand how all these people talking about ethics think this is ethically a good idea to tell people fatness is good. It's part of your identity, right? To a certain extent. And yeah.
No, the speaker for that fat talk, she started, my name is such and such, and I identify as fat.
Yeah.
That doesn't mean she was fat. She just identified as fat. All this is an example of what I call the reverse naturalistic fallacy. The naturalistic fallacy everybody knows, I think. What is natural is good. What is natural is ethical. It's been used, for example, in studies of gays. So you can find many books from 20 years ago that recount all the examples of same-sex attraction in the animal kingdom, and these are used to buttress the fact that human homosexuality is good or natural because it's found in the natural world. Well, that's of course fallacious because if it wasn't found in the natural world, that doesn't mean that homosexuality is wrong. Or if you find that you made a mistake in observing nature, for example, female bonobos do not in fact rub their genitals together, then all of a sudden your morality about humans has to change because it's a condition of nature. The reverse naturalistic fallacy, which I thought I invented, but somebody told me it had been in the parlance before, is the reverse view. It's what is good in humans has to be seen in nature. So if it's good in humans, if you see a lot of humans that identify as not being males or females, then we have to automatically say, well, that in nature there's a whole spectrum of sex. Or
the clownfish.
Sorry?
The clownfish.
Yeah, a clownfish, or that's another example. So, or, I mean, there's any number of, I think the whole problem of the ideology of, the incursion of ideology into biology can be explained by the fact that people need to see in nature what they feel is morally good themselves. And that's the distortion of truth that bothers me.
Yes, and in addition also that there's a long history of politicians and governments instrumentalizing science to produce data that supports what they want to do anyway, right? And so it used to be done more by picking and choosing the studies, which is an approach many people have tried. But now, increasingly in the last couple of years, I've seen requests for proposals by our government agencies that were directly aimed at supporting social policies by the administration. And they don't even, the way the language is written, it's not even particularly hidden. I mean, it's not, and that's why, we also want to talk a little bit about pseudoscience, because if you already ask a scientist to do a study to support a certain point, that's no longer science, right? Because we have to ask the question and be open to any result. We could, for example, do a study, try to understand which factor influences educational attainment or so on. But now the questions are phrased more along the lines of demonstrate that structural factors or structural racism is to blame for these differences in attainment. And that, to me, this is not science, and this is how I got into this, is by just reading a lot of requests for proposals, and it really snuck into there in the most shocking way. And proposals that make zero sense. I mean, one proposal had a request for studying microbiological communities to understand how exclusion of groups can lead to othering and belonging, and what we can learn for humans from one singular cell organisms doing this.
Well, that reminds me of every year I go to my conferences, and the kinds of talks that I have been seeing like recently. Last year, there was one on, and this is in the College Fix. You can find all the description and the videos there if you don't believe me. But last year there was one on how racism, and in particular redlining, impacts sugar ants. And another poster on how ableism acts on crickets. It's like, you can't be serious,
But the truth is, stuff like that, I think, also goes through for publication very easily, right? I think maybe that's why they write it like that.
These are big universities too. Cornell was one of the implied universities, right?
Boom, published. No questions from the editor for this kind of stuff. So what role do you think politically correct language played in all of this? Because I felt this is how the censorship first got active, is around mandating terms, mandating language.
Well, we had a good example the other day. I can't remember the name of the person that talked about it. It's the changing of biological names. Every animal and plant has both a Latin binomial, which is untouchable, because that's the way we actually identify things in the literature. I mean, for example, I worked on Drosophila melanogaster. It's called the fruit fly. That's the common name, but Drosophila melanogaster is the way we identify it. But now, the botanists are trying, the zoologists won't have this, thank goodness, but the botanists are now looking, I call them the peck sniffs, because they're going through the whole group of Latin names and changing this genus or the species if they're considered to be offensive. In animals, there's that beetle called something Hitleri, and that's very offensive, but it cannot be changed because the Zoological Nomenclature Committee won't let it. But any plant that has Cafferi in it, in the species name, is going to be deep sixed. And what that's going to do is completely confuse the botanical literature from the very beginning, because a plant, beginning with Linnaeus in the 17th century, has had the same Latin name forever and ever and ever. If you change that, what are you going to do? Go back through the literature and say, oh, you just can't do it. So just even the basic practice of biology and how you identify things is going to be harmed this way.
Yeah.
But there's a lot more stuff that maybe Luana or somebody else can talk about.
Yeah, also on the other side, language used to prop up things that don't really deserve these terms. For example, I saw a lot of requests for proposal for so-called gender measurement. And I thought, whoa, gender, how do they actually measure that? Do we need to spend money to figure out how females and males differ biologically? Is that not established? So I started looking into it, and of course it refers to gender identity, and participated in a couple of webinars and calls, and I was really surprised to see that we're spending, about $30–40 million on developing surveys for self-reporting of gender. And this is what goes through as measurement of gender. So for me as an experimentalist, this is not really measurements in the traditional sense. And even using the term measurements, it kind of gives you the sense that this is something that's real, is that real that you can actually measure it objectively, if it's just not true. So I think this is a bit of a misnomer, but they use these terms to make it sound like you can, take a ruler and weigh and measure gender expression. And in fact, all you do is have people fill out a survey. And this costs a lot of money for the taxpayer to develop these surveys, apparently.
Yeah, this self-identification, which is rife now, falls into the group of the things that we need to avoid as scientists,
Right.
which is confirmation bias.
Exactly.
You're not necessarily what you say you are. So,
Right.
I mean, the psychology has proven that over and over again. So,
The other thing that has been quite surprising to me in my conferences, this has been several years in a row, like the presidential addresses that opened the conferences in the biology conferences, they used to be like really motivational, like fun talks to watch and motivational talks. And nowadays, they're all about how horrible the society is, how racist, how eugenicist, how terrible we are, how exploitative of the third world and the helpers and all that. And you know, last talk was literally like how eugenicists are still among us. And the examples given were like people looking into population genetics of humans and the potential accumulation of detrimental mutations because of medicine, like just theoretical, that's considered eugenics. The author never suggested any eugenic action to be taken to address that, just calculating changes, and you know, this is how motivational things are.
Demoralizing
Yeah.
interaction. Yeah, the other thing I want to draw some attention to is also we have more and more, I would say, fairly trivial projects in finding. I see that not only in biological science, I see that everywhere. Things that everyone with two eyes can figure out by themselves now are research studies. And I think it has to do with the fact that things have become politically so contentious that the safe choice is to work on something, and that will also get funded. It's kind of obvious. So I see studies all the time like inflation hits low-income people the most. Like, do we really have to study this? I mean, it's obvious. Huh? Yeah. So if we're looking for things like that, I see this in biology too. There is sometimes, I mean, you know, where you just go, this is nothing really exciting anymore. And I have friends in the social sciences who are very concerned about this, particularly how it changed in the last 2 decades. 20 years ago, students would go out after graduating and pick literally on purpose the most controversial topics they can work on, like international sex trafficking, corruption. They wanted to understand all these things. They were interested in that. And now it's not possible anymore. They all pick really safe projects that are so irrelevant. You're like wondering why it should get funded. And it's just to not rub anyone the wrong way. So I think this is a real problem for American science and ultimately for progress in this country. And maybe we can go in a little bit in another big issue, which is education before university. So K through 12, we haven't talked about that very much at the conference, but it's a big issue for us when undergrads already come with this idea that sex is on a spectrum, kind of in formative years. It's hard to kind of get that out of their heads, right? Yeah. So can you talk a little bit about education and what has happened in K through 12?
well, I have no kids, so it would be you or Luana would have to talk about that. So,
Obviously, one thing that already people have already talked about is like the sex ed has become corrupted, right? So they are now showing videos about how you can change your gender. In my local school, I mean, I had to push back on that. How you can change your gender. I mean, this is now, you know, teaching about sex education, showing that you can change your sex. I mean, that's confusing to say the least. No wonder they get to college not knowing there are two sexes anymore.
Right. No, absolutely. I think, honestly, I think that's criminal. But it's crazy for us because we rely also on kids getting interested in science in middle school at the latest. I mean, at some point, everyone is interested in what's happening around them, and this is how we recruit. This is how kids understand they might want to go to college and study natural sciences. And it's painful to watch and to see how little influence we also have about what's taught there. I think, honestly, scientists have to organize much more around that. Sex ed has been really corrupted, but also standard biology, textbooks. So you pointed me to a resource where they list all the textbooks that have replaced, insinuating, sometimes kind of subtly through the language, or clearly stating that sex is a spectrum, right, and can change and all these things. Yeah.
Or that in humans where sex determination happens through chromosomes, right. That chromosomes have no real relationship to sex, so they're changing the language in big biology books to like remove language that suggests that it is a determinant. So that, you know, sometimes people with Y chromosomes can be women. That's...
And this is super complicated because it's state by state, but in California, where I live, we do not have a state curriculum, and we also do not have a law that says that the curriculum needs to be evidence-based or true that the schools use. So basically, every school district can pick their own curriculum, and you know, if you have a particularly woke administrator, which is likely in San Francisco Bay Area, they quickly will pick something that sounds good, and then that will be implemented without any expert review if what's in there is actually accurate. And I think that is really deeply problematic on many levels, not only in biology, also for other hot button topics that are being taught, including critical race theory, our history as a country, the founding of the United States, all these things are touched by that. But in biology, it's particularly interesting because it comes in through biology textbooks, through the science pathway, but also through sex education, which is now completely different from what it was. And parents are really shocked to see what's being taught, and have had only limited success pushing back. You know, I mean, I pushed back against some of the things that were taught for my kids, but that was a private school initially. I succeeded with that, but in public school, I hear there's absolutely no chance to push back against non-scientific, quasi-religious beliefs being taught now in our schools using taxpayer money.
Yeah, lest this devolve into a kvetching session, I'd like to ask my fellow panelists, you know, so Julia, you just said that pushing back is of minimal usefulness. Other people have said that fighting against the government is minimal usefulness. I remember the other day when they asked 3 people, you know, what did you do in light of this wokeness? And 2 guys said, well, I retired, and another one said, I quit. So I mean, I would like to ask you, if you could change one thing to improve the ideological quality or the lack of ideology in science, what would you do? What's the most important thing to do?
I would work on education in K through 12, and I would try to maybe pass a law that the curriculum has to be accurate. Huh? True, yeah.
Well,
and then and maybe work on a model curriculum. Luana shared with me actually sex ed curriculum of your kid, right? And I looked into it, and it was really interesting because it wasn't actually generated by any biologists or specialists, but by LGBTQ activists. And they call it the National Standards for Sex Education. And it sounds awesome. If you're just a regular parent, you just look at this, you're like, great. And they say, we are evidence-based, we are this and that. It's all a lie. I looked into it, and no, not evidence-based. And it's also not real, and they just pushing ideology. I looked at all the standards. I think maybe should write a paper on it or make a proposal because it's so nuts what's in there. I mean, from grade 1, they are taught that surrogacy is a normal and equivalent way of having children than a natural pregnancy and things like that. So it's all ideological from the get-go. It has nothing to do with actually preparing. And again, you know, my point about harms, I just want to point this out on sex ed. We have now a huge decline in condom use in high schoolers. It has been documented, a huge explosion of STDs. And I'm sure it has to do with the fact that we don't teach them about that anymore. So high school, at Berkeley High, sex education is 5 days. And I have a colleague whose son went through it, and she told me what they talk about, and it's exclusively gender. So they don't even talk. She asked him, like, do you know how babies are made? And he was like laughing, and he said, I already knew, but they didn't teach us that in school. So given that the point of sex ed is really prevention of STDs and teenage pregnancies and nothing else, right? It's kind of criminal that they would teach this and not teach, you know, protection and other things.
I think that another thing, which is not directly related to, it's part of wokeness. So one thing that has happened in my college is a very, very steep grade inflation that is beyond control, combined with the erosion of the honor code. And the reasons for that being that social justice warriors think that law-abiding is whiteness. They literally tell you that they are serving in the honor code to prevent punishment for people that were just not clear about what constituted cheating in the particular situation, and they're there to minimize the consequences. And the grade inflation, largely initiated by several professors who claim self-grading is the best way to go because only the student can know how much they learned. So in the end of the course, the student submit a grade. And all of that dilutes expectations and harms the students that come without a culture of studying the most. So I have been writing to the local student newspaper explaining that this actually doesn't help anyone. It harms the weakest of the students because they will just cruise and knowing that they will self-assign an A at the end of the course and not learn anything. It harms the strongest students as well because now everybody has an A and their A is not valued anything. So these, sometimes I have seen a few colleagues that were adamant for this method, like, step back a little bit and, sometimes at the thought that this may be a harmful strategy to the very one you're trying to defend and help, sometimes that can have a small effect.
But you're suggesting that we deflate grades, which is impossible, right? So,
I'm suggesting that we implement rigor so that it pushes people to studying, right?
You really think that's possible?
That we return rigor? Yeah. I think if the administration wanted, that would be very easy, very accomplished,
so we
very
have to
easy.
change the administration.
That's the big problem. Is like, are we rotten to the core or not?
Or we can just reintroduce SAT,
Reintroducing SAT would
Simple.
be a first step.
And then, the ones who study will do well on the SAT. Yeah. But it is a problem, I think, for the US, also for, all the way up to national security, that we now teach children in school to believe in superstition, quasi-religion. At the same time, we don't push them to work hard. And then we send them to university and think we can all magically fix this in 1 or 2 years. It's definitely not happening. And if you look at the National Science Foundation, the report that they give out on the status of science in the United States, the last 3 years were the first time in American history that China has overtaken us in the publication of high quality papers. So both quality and quantity of papers for the first time, 3 years in a row. And I think it's not a coincidence. I mean, we really have to watch it and push back much harder than we have been in order to get back to where we were, a leadership position in science and innovation worldwide.
But do we really need that? I mean, my view has always been, I don't care what country in the world is the best in science, as long as we're doing our best. If China does better, are we going to need to keep up with them or not? I mean, what's important is science in general, not necessarily the U.S. is best. But anyway, should we take questions?
Yes, let's do questions. Did you want to say one thing you wanted to change? I thought too many. No, good.
She wants to deflate grades.
We didn't talk about our paper. We have a paper together that goes over various topics. So that's just a pitch for the paper. It's free. It's on Skeptical Inquirer.
The ideological subversion of science.
Yes.
Right. Okay, good.
Erosion
Question.
of biology.
Biology. Okay, sorry. Yeah. All right. Questions, please. Where are our mic runners? Please, middle.
They're probably out of microphones.
Maybe we have one here. Coming down. We have about 10 minutes. Yeah.
My question is, there's been an ongoing debate over the last couple of years whether or not our institutions that are the gatekeepers of education and knowledge can be reformed, or if they should be burned down and built back up on the ground. Given the current statement that we're now in, and it's been several years since that conversation has taken place, I wanted to ask the people here, is the solution geared more towards reformation or reconstruction?
I think you can totally reform them. It's just a couple people, majority is just sitting there silent and kind of shocked at what's happening. But I think if you make some changes swiftly, maybe some people have to go, but I think standards, accountability, and I think can totally be turned around. It's not that bad yet, but if we wait 10 more years, maybe then.
Yeah, with external pressure. I think that the free speech alliances are very good to put external pressure and shame them for these acts, right? For the anti-science acts, for all these things. Maybe there is hope, but
I mean, I just want to say there's still a ton of really, really good science going on. It's just everyone goes to fields where there's no social justice component or, it's not contentious.
It's also good to remember that there has been in the Biden administration several laws dictating DEI initiatives to NSF, NIH, so on. There has been blocking of certain data sets that cannot be studied because of controversial potential to controversies and so on before the studies are even done and so on.
So let that sink in, by the way, like scientists cannot have access to data sets from the United States because maybe what we learn from there is going to be unflattering for some.
And we paid for that data.
Yeah, exactly. Dean, this over here.
So Dean Musavi, I do a lot of work in science education, and some things just for common knowledge, where everyone here can be very effective is committees revise science education standards in your state about every 10 years. They're not on the same cycle. Quality scientific input on how those standards are written is vital. You can be the person who challenges a woke interpretation of the data if you are there when the standards are being written. And it's an uphill battle because a lot of the woke people are embedded in the system. But they're, if you don't show up, they win. Keep in mind also that in the university, when you're teaching your general education biology classes and chemistry classes, this is where future teachers learn their biology. From what I saw here, if you're a future biology teacher in this class, the lesson you took away from that question about gender is, this is a topic I will not cover in the classroom because I don't want to get fired. The data already shows the reason most faculty don't touch evolution or touch it minimally is because of fear of controversy. So if the university faculty don't fight these battles at that level, the K-12 schools are done because that's where the teachers come from.
Mention that Texas at one point, which is a huge textbook market, was considering diluting its textbooks with creationism in the evolution, or at least getting rid of evolution. And that would affect what it was taught throughout the United States because the textbook makers don't want to have a different edition for each state. And it was my friends in Texas who were at the University of Texas that went and testified at the adoption and got this idiocy thrown out. So.
It's Texas and Florida that play that role. So Ron DeSantis's influence is going to be overly large.
Okay, in the back.
Hi, Georgia with Art Duty. I just wanted to mention that there is a curriculum that was developed by a group called Gender Health Query. It was endorsed by us and LGB Alliance and several other organizations for California curriculums. You can find it on their Gender Health Query website. But she did a sort of outline that you could take and use as a template or use as is and give it to the school board when the time is up.
All right, thank you. Other questions here in the middle?
This is James Lee from the University of Minnesota. About 4 years ago, I was a reviewer for a prestigious journal. For a paper, the topic was sexual selection in humans. So I was one of 4 reviewers. We all gave favorable reviews. The editor rejected the paper. But the authors stuck to it. They appealed. And so the editor said, okay, all right, we'll go through more reviews. But then they brought in more reviewers, and then they couldn't find any reviewers who would give a thumbs down. But they found some reviewers who did language policing, like, you can't say this, you can't say that, and you got to do more contextualization. And so the paper finally came out, and it was forced to be accompanied with all these commentaries by an anthropologist who knew nothing, and then by a geneticist who humiliatingly was forced to say, Darwin's theory of sexual selection, which still is in some doubt, blah, 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 blah. This was a frustrating process. I didn't understand at the time why exactly does this topic make people uncomfortable. And I was talking about it with one of the speakers the other day, William Costello, and we agreed plausibly that, well, people are uncomfortable because they see it as enforcing the incel narrative. And correctly or not, incels are right-coded, and so But now I'm not so sure. I mean, thinking about it more, does the editor of Nature know what incels are? I'm not really sure.
Was it accepted in the end?
It was in the end accepted, yes. You can look it up, the Nature. You can look up the hundreds of pages of reviews that are posted alongside it. And then I started to pay attention to the field of sexual selection, and I see this discomfort everywhere. Like, there was a big review of sexual selection that came out in Nature that was just like larded with all this wokeness. And I'm just wondering from this panel if you have any insights or understanding of why this particular subfield is kind of wandering off to the side like this.
Well, it's human exceptionalism, is my view. I mean, we're not supposed to be subject to the same forces in our minds as other animals are in their bodies. And so sexual selection, as Luana said, is a function of a gamete size difference between males and females. But if we admit that, then we have to admit that our minds are molded by evolution, not just our bodies. And if we admit that, then the whole door swings open about differences between groups, between individuals, you know, between males and females, and then we just become another animal. We're not special. So.
Yeah. And you know, it's ultimately the blank slateism. So if you admit that there are ultimately differences between males and females, and therefore sexual selection in a certain direction, you are admitting that individuals are different and so on, and it breaks the exceptionalism. Yeah.
Other questions? Yes. Over here. Next are you.
I have to challenge Jerry. So, it's interesting. You say that I have a science background. I also happen to follow religion or a certain religion, but you say that religion and science are incompatible, which I agree with. But so is oil and water. They're both essential to I think to humankind and human flourishing. So I think I'm going to challenge you with: are you reaping what you've sown? The good thing about traditional religion is there was an absolute truth. You would argue some of it was false, but there was a drive toward absolute truth and an exterior being that defined that truth. You had problems with that in biology. But by eliminating that religion, you have a new religion. So what we're seeing is the characteristic.
Sorry, what's the new religion?
The new religion is, well, the rise and triumph of the modern self. In other words, each individual is God, each individual has their own truth, and then the world has to conform to their personal truth. Identity politics, all these things happening in sex. So what's happening in young people is there's a new religion. They believe this meta-narrative that your scientific facts, they don't want to hear scientific facts. They have a new meta-narrative that they believe without facts. It's no longer traditional religion, it's a new religion. It's a religion of self. So by eliminating traditional religion, I think you perhaps have helped create this new religion, and now you're fighting it because the traditional religions at least had absolute truth. The new religions have no truth, and now you're dealing with that.
Well, yeah, I mean, the argument you're making was addressed by Richard Dawkins in The Spectator last week. It's the God-shaped hole argument, that each of us have a need for some kind of superstitious or numinous or some kind of belief that gives us meaning in our lives. If we don't have traditional religion, we fill that hole with something like crystals or Scientology. Well, that's a
Gender
religion.
spectrum. No.
And I don't believe that for several reasons. First of all, personally, I don't have a God-shaped hole. I don't need any of that stuff, nor do many. I mean, Northern Europe is basically all atheistic. If you go to Iceland, 0% of the people under 25 years old believe in God. Now, you think, well, if you went to Iceland, it's going to be full of people that believe in fairies and elves and stuff like that. But that's not true. I don't believe, I mean, sorry?
Humankind has a God-shaped hole, whether you do or not.
Well, I don't believe that because it's, wait a minute, let me answer. If humankind has a God-shaped hole, then the decline of religion, at least in the West over the past 200 years, from a point where everybody believed in God, to a point now where in the United States, 25% of people don't adhere to any religion at all. Well, you know, the God-shaped hole is getting smaller and smaller and smaller. And as Steve Pinker says, he thinks that eventually it's going to go away because of things like science and rationality.
I don't think it's gotten smaller. It's been
filled by a new religion, and that discussion,
Okay.
Well, if you
then-
define science as a religion, yes, I'm deeply religious, okay? That's filling my God.
This is let's continue that conversation. I want to get one more question before the break, or before Greg's keynote, actually. Yeah.
Thank you, guys.
Yeah.
I see absolutely no problem being an atheist and deriving objective moral values, and standing up against wokeness. My question was, first I was going to jokingly, facetiously say, what is China's DEI policy? Maybe we should copy that. But seriously, I'm wondering which fields, if any, have been least captured by this diversity stuff, because people used to joke about airplane pilots and brain surgeons. Oh, I only want the most qualified person via meritocracy to fly my plane or perform brain surgery. But in recent years, it's literally has been infected. So my question is, what, if any, are the least infected, and how can we copy that, if so? And with this recent fire thing, I'm worried, and I'm not making any claims, I'm just worried that the LAFD has also been captured, and that is deeply, deeply consequential. And we shouldn't have to wait for lawsuits like what might happen with the trans stuff.
So for just really briefly, because we have to go on, but we wrote a paper on this for all the academic funding agencies, and they all captured, and it's because it was an executive order. So they all have to comply. So this is a Biden administration did this really early in the administration. They put out an executive order saying all agencies are hereby directed to comply and develop plans how these elements, DI and other things, are incorporated on all levels of the agency. And this is notwithstanding the fact that some agencies like NASA cannot be directed by the president, because American people in their wisdom have understood that the president shouldn't really interfere and meddle with what NASA does directly, but they can do it through the budget. And this is what they've done. So instead of saying, we direct you to do this, they said, we direct you to develop a plan. And if you don't have a plan that we like, you won't get the funding for next year. And this is through the Office of Management and Budget, they push that through. So that can also be reverted. But this is why we saw this everywhere and so total. And in between, probably some agencies have pushed back more than others. NASA has redefined equity to be equal opportunity, which was kind of a creative solution. But depends, I don't think anyone is completely untouched. Yeah. All right, with that, thank you all for your questions. Thank you, Luana and Jerry.